Welcome into the Hot Read Podcast live here on Friday, January the 10th. One half of the backward hat boys today. I saw that in the middle of the countdown here. Stoney had the backwards hat on. I said, I might as well join it. And it doesn't look good, but I'm going to do it today because you know what? The upper management of 440 Sports Network, who wants us to be buttoned up and no hat wearing, is going to get backwards hats and sweatshirts and jackets on the Hot Read Podcast because we're in basically, anarchy with the Titans right now. But my name is JT Ruhnke, host of the Hot Read Podcast, writer and producer and reporter here at Broadway Sports Media. You can find me on Twitter at JT_Ruhnke, and I'm always joined on a Hot Read Happy Hour Friday with my favorite co-host. There it is.
That one
Stoney Keeley.
It wasn't
as great. But Stoney Keeley, editor-in-chief of the Sobros Network, one half of Football and Other F Words, and co-writer over at Stacking the Inbox. Stoney, this has been one of the tryingest of weeks to be a Titans fan and be on the Titans beat. But we're here now, and we've made it to the end of the week, and it's an important time to crack open a cold one on this Happy Hour Friday. Stoney, especially this wintry Happy Hour Friday. I hope you have a sort of wintry type drink there as we continue to get Snowmageddon in Nashville here. Snowmageddon being 3-4 inches. I think that's one of potentially what we're getting right now. But how are you doing?
I'm doing well. There's a joke in there about catching 5 to 7 inches, but I'm going to be classy on this establishment and I will not make that joke. But I'm doing pretty well, JT. This has been a pretty tiring week. There's been a lot going on with the firing of Ran Carthon, which we kind of dissected on Tuesday's show. And then we find out we lose Mike Keith to the Tennessee Volunteers. And now, it's kind of like just the cycle, the way these things go, whether you're done processing your emotions, whether you've felt all there is to feel or not, the show goes on, and now they're cycling through GM interview requests, and we're hearing names pop up left and right, and it's just kind of like a sobering reality of life in the NFL. It's like you don't get to feel a certain way for too long. We're on to the next thing, and that's kind of where I'm at. But I'm ready to take the weekend off. I'm gonna rest. I'm gonna prop my feet up. I'm gonna enjoy this snow. I love watching the snow fall gently. I think I'm going to write a poem about it after we get off this show, as a matter of fact. And I'm going to watch some movies. We've got a roast in the crock pot. It's going to be a nice, peaceful winter weekend here at Sobros HQ. So I'm looking forward to it. We gotta talk about these GM candidates first.
We do, and hopefully, I think we're going to hopefully know who the GM is. Well, as I say, this will be a very important part of the show with the quote unquote GM. I put quotes around the GM anywhere I could on today's show. We'll be talking about, hopefully that this GM gets picked soon because, like you said, next week it's kind of gearing up for the Senior Bowl. And if this new GM in quotes, is truly all ball all day, well, they better get their boards and get everything ready for what I think is going to be one of the best Senior Bowls we've seen in a long time. And considering how much the Titans like to draft from the Senior Bowl, they better get their butts in gear, but we'll get into all of those things. A couple of housekeeping notes before we dive into all of that. Got to give a shout out to our wonderful and amazing sponsors, new sponsors, might I add, ML Rose Craft Beer and Burgers with their 7 wonderful locations in Capitol View, Franklin, Gallatin, Melrose / 8th Avenue, Mount Juliet, Sylvan Park, and an 8th one coming soon to Inglewood. Have the absolute best craft beers and burgers around. I love ML Rose, and you should too. More on them later in the show. Stoney, I want to start, before we talk about these GM candidates, I want a couple of thoughts days after the firing of Ran Carthon. And this thought came to mind when I saw what the Raiders did in firing both their head coach, Antonio Pierce, and their GM, Tom Telesco, as Diana Rossini tweeted out earlier today, in which she said, "From what I was told, Telesco was fired mostly because ownership seems to prefer having the general manager and head coach more connected, like a cohesive partnership. rather than something that feels more arranged or forced. Tom Brady, that being, has a lot of influence in Las Vegas. And that piqued my interest on that one as a team who, may be in a similar situation as the Tennessee Titans. But it seems like they're doing good process here, which is getting them all on the same page as once. We're hitting the restart button, but we're starting fresh. And that simply has not been the Titans process for the last 3 years or so. And I think that is something that you can take from this point onward, right? And kind of use that as a gauge between these two teams who are bottom 5 in the league right now.
I like that.
And kind of look at them. The good process of starting anew with everyone from an optics position, I should say, because we'll get into how I think the Titans process may be a little bit more nuanced than people think, versus what the Titans do, which is pair new GM with the former coach and then pair the former GM with a new coach, and so on and on the cycle goes. However, I do, even though this Titans process, how they do their business, has bad optics and on paper looks really bad, perhaps the GM and coach have been aligned or more so in line than we think they are, aligned than we think they are at this moment. And this comes from our friend Zach Lyons, who tweeted this out, I believe, either earlier today or yesterday, where he said Charles Robinson and Diana Rossini have said that people in the league told them that Chad Brinker was the GM, basically the de facto GM. Robinson said that since Chad got promoted, and Rossini said anytime there was talk with teams about players/trades, they do business with Chad. Yet all the moves were ran. And this kind of continues to reinforce the idea that, like that show, the part of the show WandaVision where it's Agatha all along. It's kind of we could just Photoshop Chad Brinker's head onto that and say it was Chad all along, because when you really look at it over the last year and what we continue to learn about this team, it seems like it was really Chad all along. And so when you take that into perspective, right, with that promotion at the same time of the hiring of Brian Callahan, and you're believing that, behind the scenes, Chad Brinker was kind of technically really the GM, could that also mean that we're really just looking at a GM and head coach that are kind of aligned now, even though the optics and on paper it doesn't look that way? That's a thought that came across my mind. I'd be interested to see what you think of that. I'd be interested to see what our comment section thinks of that. And by the way, if you are joining us live today on Twitter or Facebook, do us a favor and head on over to the Broadway Sports Media or 440 Sports YouTube channel, where you can comment on that question. But I think, even though the process might be bad, there is a little bit more nuance to it, like I continue to say about this entire cycle.
Well, I think it's interesting because it's like you alluded to, it's or not flat out saying it, but it's like, if you wanted continuity, we shouldn't be up in arms about Rand Carthon getting fired, because Chad Brinker and Brian Callahan were running the ship all along. So we actually are getting continuity there. So that's where I think it's kind of funny. There's been a lot of he said, she said stuff come out this week, and the spectrum seems to range from Chad Brinker is a snake oil salesman to nobody knows what Rand Carthon was doing in the building. But I think the bottom line is that Chad Brinker is running the show, and that's how all of the dominoes have fallen. It sounds like, and I can't remember my source on this, but it sounds like Brian Callahan is going to report to the GM, who's going to report to Chad Brinker, who has final say on all football matters. So if that's the case, then you would think, okay, well, maybe this is progress, right? The positive, optimistic view of this is that, okay, maybe they really did learn that this collaboration message they were spewing last offseason didn't yield good results, and now we're going to go back to a more basic structure of this person reports to that person, reports to that person. Yeah. I don't know. I think that you have to do a little bit of mental gymnastics to make sense of all of this, but I do think that there is a pretty clear timeline for this move benefiting the Titans in the long term, and I think that's the hope that fans should hold on to. Though I do like Logan's clarification in the chat. Chad made the good moves and Rand made the bad ones.
Yeah, akin to Kelly and Downing with offensive plays under Vrabel. Yeah, it always has to be black or white. It never can be gray. It's that's how at least I feel like the Titans sometimes say. As here, as Steve says in the chat right now, why doesn't management just come forward and clarify who does what?
Yeah,
You kind of sometimes
that's been what fans are calling for this week.
Yeah.
I think.
And as Lewis says that I took his take about this yesterday and says that the connection is already there. And apparently I'm a stealer and I lie and I cheat and I steal. It's great. But I do agree with you, right? On the notion that things had to maybe take a step back and get worse optic wise before they could make leaps and jumps into being a better organization and a better run organization. And that's the kind of article and the gist of my article I wrote over on Broadway Sports Media. Those types of things, right? It feels like it just took some time to get through the bad process to where they need to be right now. And so even when they bring in this new guy who you talk about, reports to Chad Brinker, it doesn't really seem to me when you talk about that power structure, right? Where Brian Callahan reports to the GM, director of scouting, assistant GM, whatever you want to call it, and then reports to that person, reports to Chad Brinker, actual GM. It really feels like whoever, like Brian Callahan's like livelihood, or if he stays or goes, would still ultimately go through Chad Brinker, right? Because he does make the final say. And if Chad Brinker is kind of in line and has those glowing things to say about Brian Callahan, I think even though they're not going to come out and say it, that's the power structure we're going to have here. And so I think that's at the end of the day, optics wise, we can look from an outside and compare the Raiders and the Titans from an outside perspective and on paper of what they're doing. But inside the building and through the nuance of it, it really feels like these two organizations are doing the same thing, just a little differently and more uniquely. I don't know why we can't just do it. Why can't the Titans just be normal and do it in a normal way? Like, why can't you be normal? And then it's just the cat screaming or whatever meme right there. Like, at the end of the day, I think that's where we are right now.
My fear, though, is just that the Titans are setting a precedent. And I know, like, the ideas out there, like, well, hey, maybe this is them finally getting everything correct and getting everybody on the same page and moving forward. We shouldn't have to worry about this kind of thing anymore. But the track record of recent years is just, it's a lot to stomach. And for me, it feels like we are setting this precedent where if the results aren't where we think they should be, someone has to take the fall for it. And they're preaching, Chad Brinker's preaching, like, draft and develop, patience, those sort of things. But from what the ownership's actions have said, there's not going to be patience. If the results are bad, somebody's going to have to go. That's the standard we're setting. And so I feel like they're constructing they're structuring this organization in a way where they have a perennial fall guy. Like, this year it was Rand Carthon. Last year it was Mike Vrabel. Next year it could be Brian Callahan. But they can point to somebody and say, well, that's the reason that we were bad, but we've corrected it and we're moving forward. And that's kind of the darkest timeline, I think, is the realization that there's nothing that we can really do about ownership. And that's discouraging. I think that's the saddest part of this week. I don't think you had to smear the name of Rand Carthon the way that some sources are doing. And that's where I'm at, is like, I want to see it before I believe it. I want to make it through January of 2026 without having to talk about someone else being fired. That's my fear in this. But again, I go back to the optimistic view, is that this was the correction of a mistake and they're going to be unified moving forward. And we're going to see this translate to wins on the field.
I sure hope so, Stoney, because we had 3 Victory Tuesdays on the Hot Read podcast
That's
in
crazy.
the year 2024. I certainly would like more next season so that people just we don't have to get people like one of our favorites in the chat, Daniel, giving us one-word descriptions of how he is feeling throughout the week. Let's get to a couple of these comments here. Kyle Medina saying, are we sure Callahan survives this GM search? I would feel pretty confidently that he does. I think if you were going to fire Brian Callahan, you would have done it already. But like we already kind of laid out, the power structure seems to be that Chad still has final say over basically everything, making him the GM. And that means that Brian Callahan, ultimately would be a decision in Chad Brinker's hands after what we heard from Chad Brinker about Brian Callahan in his article with Jim Wyatt earlier this week. Nothing is telling me that that is the case. Jake says, evening, fellas. Think we get a shock announcement this weekend? I'm interested what you mean by that. Maybe it's more so like the coaching and things. That's something we haven't heard about. I know
that's what I was about to say.
I think that's where you're getting at, Jake, there, as we kind of saw some teams start to make those moves today. The Dolphins firing their special teams coach. How about that? Colt Anderson, not the first special teams coach to get fired in the year 2025. Funny enough, that is the team that drafted Malik Washington. So maybe that is good for the narrative right there. I don't know.
How about that?
They also fired Wes Welker, who was like their wide receivers coach, which kind of crazy. I didn't know he was a wide receivers coach, but kind of feels like if the Titans were going to start making some of those changes, I feel like it's coming up, right?
It just dawned on me, JT, that Tyreek Hill was wanting out of Miami and saying he was done, but then after a meeting with coaches, he decided to stay. Was there like a hostage situation behind closed doors down in Miami where he was like, I ain't working with Wes Welker no more, and Mike McDaniel said, bet, he's out of here? I mean, I would probably choose Tyreek Hill over Wes Welker if I were Mike McDaniel too, but that's I'm just drawing parallels and completely making stuff up on the fly.
That is fair. I do think when getting to Jake's question here, would it be a shock? What's more of a shock? Colt Anderson and let's say, what's more of a shock? Nick Holtz getting the can this weekend or Colt Anderson staying?
Oh,
what
man.
is a bigger shock? Because if we haven't heard things yet about Colt Anderson, like the more and more we get into this cycle, it makes me feel like Colt Anderson is coming back for year 2, right?
We are in that prime Friday evening news dump window.
I do have my Twitter up still.
Good, yeah.
Just in case anything does come down the pipe, so that we can talk about it on the spot. Listen.
But to answer your question, though, I would be more shocked if Nick Holtz was fired than if Colt Anderson stays. I think Colt Anderson should stay. I know that he's been thrown under the bus, but we have a tendency to remember the early part of the season, and that kind of sticks with us. And I think it kind of clouds sometimes how we view where the trajectory of the season took us, how it ended. We're still thinking back to like, oh, the offensive line is ass and oh, special teams is ass. But special teams got a lot better. I think Colt Anderson did a good job of churning bodies until he got the right guys in there. And I think the unit improved quite a bit from where it was early in the season to where it is now. So I think you can make a pretty good case for Colt Anderson staying, but I still won't be surprised if he's fired as a sort of sacrificial lamb to save face, or, if Chad Brinker wants Brian Callahan to overhaul his coaching staff, like you got to get rid of somebody. It's a pretty easy sell to the fan base that has their pitchforks out for the guy already.
Yeah, I think I'm with you there. Jake says
Holtz would be
out for me. He says, didn't special teams improve? Will a GM be hired really fast? Those are the types of things I think he's asking for here. Like, it's hard for me outside of the scapegoat optics, which we've already seen once this week with Rand Carthon a little bit. It's hard for me to think of a reason that Colt Anderson, be it as it may, that he probably, if Amy Adams Strunk did not make that firing, he probably would have been our Hold My Beer award for some just absolutely atrocious press conferences this year. His group was, bar none, maybe along with the offensive line, the best improved unit or group of players on this team. And I think that says something, and I think it's worth something. And so if you were going to make that firing, I think at this point it would be nothing more than being a scapegoat and being there. I think Holtz, that's a tough one, because once again, if Brian Callahan likes what he does for the scheme, how much really more can you kind of say about him to fire him, right? He's not the one play calling at this point.
Well, he's probably the one, like, if you secretly want continuity and stability, he's probably the one you fire, because he's not calling the plays, not directly, impacting the offense on game day in that fashion. So you probably could at least get away with firing him and maintaining on offense. So
yeah,
I don't know.
I'm with you there. And then, as Jake says here as well, I think they will, and we'll get into the GM talk here, the search, I should say. I think they need to really expedite this, because Jake says also surely they would want the GM by Senior Bowl after missing a lot last year due to hiring. Well, once again, that's another nuance thing, right? Because as Rand Carthon was supposedly helping out in the coaching search, Chad Brinker was the one at the Senior Bowl last year. So
I like the bit that Zach's working right now, that Chad Brinker was down at the Senior Bowl to coerce Jim Nagy into joining the Titans as its a GM a year later. This has all been the plan all along.
This is a big brain take there. I like it. And so, but yes, I do. At the bottom line is they need to expedite this process, because we've seen time and time again how much the Senior Bowl has impacted this roster. You look at last year and just kind of the players they got, 6 out of the 7 outside of JC Latham, all from the Senior Bowl. This is a thing. This is a place I think they really like to find some of those diamonds in the rough, I guess, those little tiny players in the back ends of the rounds that can really be impact guys. And so they're going to have to do this really fast. And so with that, let's just go through the list real quick of who they are planning to interview this weekend. Today, of course, they completed 2 of their 3 interviews so far with Reggie McKenzie out of Miami, Thomas Dimitrov, who was the ex-GM from Atlanta, and then also reportedly they are meeting, I guess probably now as we talk, they are meeting with John Spytek from Tampa. Tomorrow they will meet with Ed Dobbs, Matt Berry, Terrence Gray, and Kat Hickman, and then Sunday they will meet with Mike Borgonzi and Ian Cunningham. We'll get to a lot of those names, as well as John Eric Sullivan from Green Bay. We'll get into a lot of those guys who our favorites are to make the case for their spot here in Tennessee, which guys we might want to stay away with. But before we get to that, got to give a wonderful shout out to our wonderful sponsors, Melrose. ML Rose, sorry. I get it. I get confused with their location and that one, because they do have 7 wonderful locations, being in Capitol View, Franklin, Gallatin, Melrose / 8th Avenue as well, Mount Juliet, Sylvan Park, and also an 8th one coming soon to Inglewood. Over 25 beers on tap. My favorite right now is the ML Rose Owl Lager, as well as their fried pickles and peppers. They're absolutely a must try. I love them with their ranch. So good, so good, but they really have anything you could possibly want right now. Snacks, wings, sandwiches, and of course their craft burgers, including their burger of the month right now, the Chopped Cheese Supreme. I know, Stoney, for you specifically, you like the Crunch Wrap burger, which is basically like a scratch-made Crunch Wrap, but with all the burger ingredients. That sounds delicious.
It's so good.
I was hoping to get out there this weekend to try and taste some more things on the menu. I haven't got a chance to, but with the weather, we'll see how that plays out. But eventually, probably next week, I'm dying to try this Chopped Cheese Supreme. Once again, thank you to ML Rose for sponsoring the show. Got to get out there and tell them that the Hot Read podcast sent you, because they do really good business out there. You got anything else on ML Rose right now?
Oh, I can go for hours on ML Rose. I was just there last week. I know they've got some really cool dry January options
Oh, yes.
for like non-alcoholic cocktails or like the infused drinks or whatever. There's some options there. I'm a degenerate. I will not be participating in dry January, so I got the Black Abbey Krampus, a really nice porter. That craft beer menu is no joke. It's awesome. I got the Jam Burger, but let me tell you something. Their apps, the app game
They're
is
so good.
fantastic. My
They kill
wife
it.
and I get like the chicken nachos all the time. The pretzel bites are the best in the game. I love their pretzel bites, and they've got these like Nashville hot cheese curds too. Like I'm telling you, if you're out at that ML Rose in Mount Juliet, any given moment, you might see me and my wife walking through the door. We love it. It's one of our favorite spots in town.
Yes, and we love it. Hope you love it as well because they take so good care of us. We want to take care of them as well. So thank you to ML Rose for sponsoring the show. All right, let's get into a couple of these guys, starting with the two they've hired already. And the first one I want to talk about is Reggie McKenzie, and I have a little bit of a background here.
The
Thanks
two
to
they've
John.
interviewed. They haven't
So far.
hired them.
Sorry, my bad. Yeah, slip. The ones they've interviewed so far. Reggie McKenzie, of course, and this is from John Gledden, kind of doing some background work here. He said, McKenzie is a Knoxville native and former Vols linebacker. McKenzie played 5 years in the NFL. He served as the Oakland Raiders general manager from 2012 to 18, helping lead the team to a 40-72 record. McKenzie began his front office career with Green Bay in 1994, eventually rising from pro personnel assistant to director of pro personnel and director of football operations. He interviewed for the Titans GM job in 2007 when Tennessee ultimately hired Mike Rainfelt. McKenzie spent 4 years with Brinker in the Packers organization. Brinker was working as a scouting assistant and pro scout at the time. Stoney, I don't know about you, just not feeling this one with Reggie McKenzie,
No,
looking at his resume and what he's brought to the table. You obviously look at his time in Oakland where, for better or for worse, the player that you can really count on for him to put on his resume is Khalil Mack. Outside of that, with the different coaches that they've had in that building and whatnot, feels like a lot of bad process during his time. Just not a guy I'm super interested in, despite people like Diana Rossini and others saying that he might be one of the top candidates. I think Terry McCormick kind of came from the top rope earlier today and said, be careful of those people who are saying there is already a favorite in the running for even before they interview, because it's probably a lot of agents, trying to fluff up their guy through different reporters and people on the beat. And so, even though Reggie seems to be a guy who is a top dollar guy for the Titans and a top candidate, there's just a lot on his record that tells me, even though he's worked with Brinker just through a lot of different processes, it doesn't feel like he would be the guy right now to come in and carry out this vision.
Yeah, and I think if you're the conspiracy theorist that thinks, like, oh, well, Chad Brinker wants to bring somebody in that he can fire in a year if it doesn't go right, or if it's, the lapdog, the lackey, the guy that'll just do whatever we say. Reggie McKenzie makes a lot of sense. He's kind of a retread executive here. He has experience as a GM. I just don't think he had enough hits. I mean, that's what it comes down to. You mentioned Khalil Mack. I was looking back through some of his drafts, and like the name that stuck out to me was like, oh, I forgot how much I loved Carl Joseph coming out of West Virginia. And like, who remembers Carl Joseph besides me in 2024? So, from a legacy standpoint and just a body of work, like maybe the familiarity, the relationship, it sort of lends itself towards a natural fit with Chad Brinker. But I just don't think the body of work is good enough stacked up against some of these other candidates that they're interviewing. And maybe it's a case where, we've talked about how potential candidates could view this job and, concerns about it not being a true GM role. But in the event that maybe some of these guys turn it down, then maybe you do your due diligence on a Reggie McKenzie. But I can't fathom. I'm having trouble compartmentalizing how you stack his body of work up against some of the other candidates and the franchises that they've come from.
Yeah, and that leads us to the other one they interviewed today, Thomas Dimitrov, another guy who seems like a little bit of doing due diligence on, mostly because
Yeah.
Dimitrov was the GM making the decisions for the Atlanta Falcons for so many years. Feels like it'd be a little bit, I mean, Thomas Dimitrov's been out of the game, so maybe he just wants to get back in that game a little bit, and maybe he sees this as an opportunity, but at the same time, it's not really technically the GM job that he would have like he did in Atlanta. And listen, I'm not a fan of either of these guys as the pick. Just, when you talk about a guy who's all ball all day, you just have to look at his track record in Atlanta. Sure, his first year, I believe, was with Matt Ryan, and that kind of got them on the right track. And sure, he had a couple of good years to begin there, all ultimately culminating in that 2016 fantastic 28-3 disaster before everything went south. But you just look back, especially on the defensive side of the ball, struggles trying to find defensive personnel that are playmakers. You go back to a lot of these different picks, Vic Beasley, Tack McKinley in the first round as well. I remember that one because that was the one where he dropped the F-bomb talking about his grandma to Roger Goodell and stuff. That was an all-time draft moment. But just like continuing to churn the first round defensive draft picks that all just were complete misses outside of Vic Beasley's 1 year wonder. To me, it just doesn't feel like a fit going from like what his personnel resume is to the fit with where he was before. Now, could they fall in love with a guy like that? And he, works well with Brinker? Sure. But for me, that is just not the guy I think they want, given what we know about what they're looking for, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly. It's a similar angle as Reggie McKenzie. I just don't think there were enough hits. Like, you want to talk about a fall off. I think people remember Dimitrov as a name, as the architect of that Falcons Super Bowl roster, basically. But I don't think people realize that there was like a John Robinson-esque fall off for Dimitrov with the defensive personnel. Like, it was like 3 years of bad picks, and ultimately the man was let go for a reason. And I don't know. I'm just generally a fan of look to the future. Don't try to run it back in situations like these. And I think there is a reason that a lot of GMs don't get a second opportunity. But to my point earlier, they might have people turn them down over concerns about what this role actually is. And if that's the case, I think you do need to be doing your due diligence on guys like these that do at least have experience in the role.
Yeah, I agree. Lewis says no Reggie. J little T is enough to handle. I don't know what me and Reggie have in common here. But
you're a lot to handle, though.
I guess
I'll give that.
I guess that. Thank you. So let's get into the guys that we do like in this cycle from this list. I have 3 that I kind of noted in my article yesterday as we look towards the rest of this Titans offseason. For me, the picks that I really, really like right now, of course, John Eric Sullivan is one that we can get into. I like John Spytek, not just because he has a cool last name, but I think he's done really good work there. And then also Terrence Gray is a guy that was on the radar for them during the last GM cycle. And I think he is kind of evolved as well. Stoney, do you have any on that list that kind of poke out to you and say this would be the guy I'm kind of have my eye on?
Well, I wrote down 4 names, and 3 of them are the 3 that you wrote down. So we're on the same page there. I also included Mike Borgonzi of Kansas City. A lot of experience there in player personnel, and that's an organization that probably exemplifies draft and develop about as well as anybody in football does. But I like those names. I really like John Spytek because I think about the scouting, the drafting, and the free agent moves that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers have made in recent years. And while, outside of the Brady Super Bowl run, they haven't had a lot of deep playoff success. They've been in the playoffs. Like, they've fielded a competitive roster for nearly half a decade now. And I don't think people, I think it's because there's not a whole lot of like flashiness to that team. They haven't been like winning Super Bowls since Tom Brady retired, but they've done a really solid job of the draft and develop mantra. Their drafts have been really great, and they've plugged holes in free agency. And I think people sleep on how well that organization has done. So, sometimes I feel like we get into this trap of, we got to have a Shanahan guy. We got to have a McVay guy. We got to have somebody from the 49ers system. Let's recreate the 49ers. Let's think outside the box a little bit. And I think the Buccaneers are one of those teams that have been quietly consistent from a personnel standpoint for years. And so, yeah, I'd be interested in plucking somebody off of that organizational tree.
Yeah, I'm with you there. Let's real quick on the Bergonzi one real quick. I do want to also note that connection between Brinker and Bergonzi. It was noted also, good on Zach Lyons to go kind of dig this up from a PK article detailing the L'Jarius Sneed trade, how Brinker was the one to really lead the charge on that to get that done, not Rand Carthon, because of his connection with Bergonzi. So that's another interesting nugget to remember when looking at these guys. Let's talk about Spytech a little bit more here. This is also from John Glennon's article, kind of detailing these guys' backgrounds. Credit to him on this for doing the dirty work so we can talk about it. Spytech has more than 18 years of NFL experience. He started in Philadelphia in 2005 as a college and pro scout, and in 2010 was named Cleveland's director of college scouting. He was a scout for 3 years in Denver before the Buccaneers hired him in 2016 as the team's director of player personnel. In 2023, Spytek was promoted to his current position. He oversees day-to-day operations of the college and pro scouting departments from Tampa Bay, among other duties. Kind of along the lines of what you've said there. When you look back at some of these draft classes that the Buccaneers have had over the past couple of years, guys that we've really liked, Cody Mock, Kalijah Cansey, Jalen McMillan this year, a lot of guys who immediately were impact players. And I think that's what the Titans need right now. I think he's got a good resume and a good eye for talent. I think he would be a guy who maybe has an opportunity to, once again, even though it really isn't the GM position, but in title, kind of step up into yet another role here. He's one of my favorites. I do want to talk about just Terrence Gray a little bit from maybe a different angle here, and why I think he might be a good selection for the Tennessee Titans. Of course, he is now with the Buffalo Bills, but Gray spent 11 seasons as a Vikings scout before heading to Buffalo in 2017. He was promoted to assistant director of player personnel in 2020, and again to his current role in 2022. He also interviewed for the Chargers general manager job last season. And here's what I think is interesting about this one, and it's really that Gray, in his role in Buffalo, even though they have Josh Allen, has been the guy to keep an eye on the quarterback talent. He's been the guy they've sent out. I know this was detailed in a behind-the-scenes kind of Buffalo Bills video that they put out every offseason, but he was the guy at Caleb Williams' pro day. He's the one doing a lot of the work on there. And so I think if you're looking in that direction, right, with the Titans having the 101, and you want a guy who has had some really decent draft classes for the Buffalo Bills, and you want a guy who has a keen eye for talent and finding a quarterback, Terrence Gray might be your option there. And so I think, his name should be in consideration there, for me, at least personally.
Yeah, I like guys that have an extensive background in scouting, and Terrence Gray has an extensive background in scouting, and Buffalo is another one of those organizations that tends to draft and develop pretty well.
Yep. And then the final one that I think both of us really like, of course, is the one that was announced today that the Titans have requested permission to speak with Packers Vice President of Player Personnel, John Eric Sullivan, for their GM job. Of course, Ian Rappaport went on to say that Sullivan is well regarded in NFL circles and was a former colleague of Chad Brinker. A little bit more on Sullivan here. He has the longest shared background with Brinker, of course, as the two spent more than a decade together in Green Bay. Like many of the candidates, Sullivan began his career as a college scout. He eventually worked his way up to director of college scouting in 2016, to co-director of player personnel in 2018, and to his current role in 2022. 2022. Sullivan's father, Jerry Sullivan, was a coach for almost 50 years in the college and pro ranks, serving as the Arizona Cardinals offensive coordinator in 2003. And this is what I think the bottom line is here, right? You talk about this vision and how much you want to emulate what worked for the Green Bay Packers, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you take that into account, it really feels hard to not say that Sullivan feels like the guy here for this team, right? It's hard to, if you want to get this vision going and get it working quickly by drafting and developing and having a shared goal, bringing in your buddy that you worked with that kind of proved that process right for over a decade seems like the guy you probably want to bring in. Now, will he jump ship from a place like Green Bay to come to Tennessee to kind of start that process all over again? I think that's the question that we have to ask. But ultimately, to me, if you're reading what this message and the vision is for the Tennessee Titans, Sullivan feels like the no-brainer guy to kind of plug in and immediately get to work.
Not only that, JT, but doesn't he just kind of feel like the right blend of experience, what they're looking for in this role, and the relationship and the connection to Chad Brinker, the familiarity there? Like it just feels to me like he is the absolute favorite for this job.
Yeah, I would agree so. And so I don't know, and maybe you can correct me if this is wrong, but they requested, so it isn't set in stone yet that he will be interviewing for it. But if he does take that interview, it feels hard for me to say that maybe they wait until after this weekend, after the snow, because of all of these interviews are virtual. Kind of the same situation with Brian Callahan, where they bring him in for a physical visit, and they kind of don't let him leave the building there. That's my 2 cents on the matter. We can get into some of your comments here if you have any thoughts on the GM search. Eddie saying Terrence Gray would be interesting. Team Ramrod says Dimitrov has been doing consulting work for teams, so he hasn't been completely out of the space. Not one of my favorite choices either, though.
Didn't he start like an analytics company too?
He might have. I
like
think you're right about that. Paul, going back to the Callahan conversation, says Callahan will be convinced to hire an OC with play calling experience and give up play calling to focus on big picture. He set the stage of the press conference. He was open to it. And we might get there, right? Like, could we see this thing like 4 weeks in next year not really continue to work? And maybe that's when we start having those conversations. Maybe, but like I think at the end of the day, if you were going to kind of say those glowing things about Brian Callahan, it feels like they were like, yes, we know you had to acclimate. Now do it because we know you can. And so I think he's going to get as much run as possible as the play caller, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree. And while I do believe Brian Callahan when he says whatever it takes to help the team, he's open to doing. I feel like that's going to be either a last resort, last ditch effort if the offense is just horrendous next season, or it's going to be potentially forced from the top down. This isn't good enough. You need to do this.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Obviously, I think he's going to try to do it until he cannot anymore. And that's the ultimate decision there. All right, let's move on to a little bit of draft talk as we dip our toe in here before we get into the full-blown entirety of it for the rest of the season. But before we do that, I have to give out a massive shout out to our other sponsor, Sinkers Beverages. Of course, they have been serving the East Nashville area for over or close to 40 years. They are a 4-time Best of Nashville Liquor Store of the Year, and for good reason, because they have simply the best selection of spirits, wines, and liquors in the town. Hope you stocked up before this winter storm, because I know I'm sure I did. I went out there to Sinkers to get fully stocked back up after the Christmas season, and when I did, I made sure to use my rewards for the in crowd, because you got to join when you go over there and sign up, because it gets you special benefits, allocations, and special access to tastings that you can only know about if you join their in crowd. Give them a follow on social media at Sinkers Bev on Twitter and sinkers.nashville on Instagram. Thank you to Sinkers for sponsoring the show as well. Search them on Uber Eats. They drive so you can drink responsibly. All right, Stoney, I've been thinking about this a little bit recently as we dip our toe into the draft process. And as much as people want to just continue to make it a Shedeur Sanders or Cam Ward conversation,
Mm-hmm.
I really do think we need to keep our options open as we continue this early off-season talk. And I really do think the 101 should not already be set in stone because, first of
Yeah.
all, did you see what Abdul Carter did last night against Notre Dame?
Oh, buddy.
I mean, they didn't get the win, but it sure wasn't because Abdul Carter wasn't a freak of nature and a wrecking force last night. Man, it's going to be hard for me to come off the idea that you even though you need a quarterback, right? You just take the best player available, which is Abdul Carter, and you're kind of set at the edge position for the next 5 years because this dude is just an absolute monster. And one of the maybe 2 blue chip players in this draft. Stoney, your thoughts on that and what Abdul Carter could be? Does he deserve to maybe be in the conversation at 101?
Yeah, absolutely. I think he's one of 5 blue chip players in this draft class. But I think he's really one of maybe 2 that look like they can be transcendent players in the NFL. And to me, it's Abdul Carter and it's Travis Hunter. And with Carter specifically, just the right blend of pass rush skill set and speed. Like the marriage of the athletic ability and the know-how. That is what is so impressive to me. And I said it, I might have written it on Stacking the Inbox, but the way that they deploy him is a lot like how they deployed Micah Parsons. And, I caught a little bit of flack. Nobody's calling for my head or anything, but I did have a couple of people like, no, there's no way Abdul Carter is Micah Parsons. Well, did you watch the game last night? Because
yeah.
I mean, that kind of looked like Micah Parsons, no?
Yeah.
And if you could go back in time and you could have Micah Parsons, I think you'd take Micah Parsons. What he came out in 2021, Blaine and Zach were talking about it on Cover 2 today. So, like, teams passed on Micah Parsons to take Zach Wilson and Trey Lance in that draft class because they needed a quarterback.
Yep.
So do you think, maybe those organizations, maybe the Jets, maybe the 49ers might like a Micah Parsons right now? That's how you can look at this. And so for me, I have no issues whatsoever with Abdul Carter being the top pick in this draft for the Titans to take him. I think Shedeur is quarterback 1 for me. The one possibility I don't really want at all right now is Cam Ward. I'm kind of out on him. I'm open to having my mind change because I'm not done with my film study on him.
Yeah, of course.
But I do think Shedeur is the safest option. But I had kind of, even before Abdul Carter just ravaged Notre Dame and before he ravaged SMU as well, I had already been kind of thinking, like, if this goes super sideways for the Titans and they end up with a top 5 pick, like I'm not sold that Shedeur Sanders is like a top 5 caliber quarterback. While I think he's the best in the draft, and I do think that if the Titans had him, they would be immensely better. I just don't know. Like, everybody was saying, well, if you don't get number 2, you have no shot at Shedeur. And I'm like, the way teams view this, like, I don't know. If they fell to 7, they might still be able to get him. And so I can't look at a prospect like that compared to Abdul Carter and say, no, they need to forgo Abdul Carter for that. I think you kind of take it on the chin. I feel like this team is going to want a veteran bridge guy anyway. And then I think you have the picks later on to take one of these developmental guys that could develop into something. I'm a fan of Will Howard. I think Will Howard could develop into something at the NFL. I like the traits of Jackson Dart. I know that offense is super wonky and you have to do a lot of projecting with Jackson Dart, but I think he has the talent to play. So I think you get a difference maker and you address the quarterback in free agency or trade and you draft a developmental guy. I have no qualms with that whatsoever.
Yeah, and I think I'm with you right there as well. But the point is, like, in this part of the offseason, and this is kind of what we'll end the show on here, but there's so many options in this draft, and you control it all, right? Certified blue
Yeah.
chipper. And you said
hmm
5. I'd be interested to know what your other 3 right now outside of Carter and Hunter are. I'm guessing maybe Will Johnson, the the defensive lineman from Michigan as well.
Mason
I forget
Graham.
Mason Graham, and then maybe are you Luther?
Luther
LB3?
is 6. Luther is 6.
Oh,
He
okay.
I've got him shaded purple right now.
Okay. I
He's
got
red
you.
that could be blue. So
Starks?
he's purple. Starks. Yeah. I'm
Okay.
a big fan
Very
of
good.
Malachi Starks.
Yeah, I think those are all fair, but when you're talking about the upper echelon of blue chip players, if you want to stick and pick a blue chip player, you go Carter and Hunter. I think even though people might be mad that you didn't get the quarterback or whatever, and this is also after a free agent, so people's perspectives are surely going to change after that. People can't be mad at you for taking Abdul Carter or Travis Hunter. If you don't get a quarterback in free agent because they've kind of fallen in love with one of these, I'm also not opposed to that, right? Like if this regime finds their guy here and really, really likes him, take your pick, right? You don't get the first pick. You hopefully don't get the first overall pick many times in a row.
Yeah.
Like you take your pick here. But also trade down, build for the future. As long as the patience is there, like Alex says here in the chat, as long as Amy doesn't have a say, we should be okay. Like as long as they're preaching patience and you want to trade out of this spot for someone who really, really loves Travis Hunter, even if you want to move down to 3 because the Browns want to come up and take one of their guys to proceed or, come after Deshaun Watson. That's something you can do here as well. But, whatever this new regime's interest is, they need to take their time and really think it through because you have kind of all the possibilities at your hand, in the palm of your hand. I do think I'm with you. I think Abdul Carter is such a game wrecker and can make this defense into what it needs to be at the next level here next year for the Tennessee Titans, assuming that L'Jarius Sneed has a bounce back year. You get some more guys in this player acquisition cycle. Drink. I think, if you have the opportunity to take a bridge quarterback now, we didn't see the bridge work for a team like Las Vegas last year, where they bring in a guy like, he was at Gardner Minshew, right? But let's say a guy like Derek Carr gets cut or they move on from him, right? I'm still not of the belief that it's going to happen, but if it does, the connection's there with Callahan and Carr. Maybe a guy that he thinks could really work in his scheme, a guy that, especially when you're talking about, Brian Callahan and his job security, right? Especially going into next year. I think the probability of Brian Callahan's job being safe in year 2 is a lot higher if you have a bridge quarterback that can reliably get you to 8-9 wins with this roster versus a Shadur or a Cam Ward, who maybe you end up with 4 or 5 at the best if things go south in that first year. For a guy like Brian Callahan to secure that third year into building this program, bridge and take a guy like Abdul Carter is where I'm at right now. And like you said, maybe my mind will be changed over the course of this draft cycle. I'm excited because there's so many interesting prospects at the quarterback position, even outside Shadur Sanders and Cam Ward. But as of right now, it's hard for me not to say that Abdul Carter is the best player right now in this draft and would really, really be nice at the 101. Anything else from you, Stoney, there on that?
No, I think you summed it up pretty well. I love Abdul Carter. I am working on a full scouting report on him for Stacking the Inbox that I was going to come out today. But then when last night happened, I was kind of like, I don't know. People might want to see some of the clips from this game. So I'm waiting for that all 22 to drop. And then I'm going to put it up next Friday.
All righty. Paul, with the last question here, and this is one on Travis Hunter. He says, is Travis Hunter elite at cornerback or wide receiver? Or is he different because he's very good at both? I do think he's very good at both. At the next level, I think those elite traits probably could stand out more as a cornerback, in my opinion, just because of his build. But then again, he's really good at both. And that's
Yeah.
what makes him such a really intriguing prospect to me, at least. I don't know if you disagree with me on that one.
Well, I think it depends on what you need him for. I think everybody seems to be thinking it's automatic he's going to play corner in the NFL. He's an athlete, man,
Yeah.
and he is the type that, for me, like, you get the ball in his hands and you let him do his thing. Like, he looks like he could be the prototypical stud Z receiver in the NFL, moving around the formations, kind of doing a few different things. I know the route refinement is an issue, but it's not a problem if you don't have him like running routes. If you just like throw him out there on screens and get the ball in his hands, or just have him run and go routes and running by people, like he's that good of an athlete, and he can make guys miss. So I think his potential at wide receiver is being slept on a little bit. And I think there's some issues with physicality that kind of make him a little scheme specific. You can talk to some people and they say this guy is the best zone corner in the draft, but if you don't run a lot of zone, or if you're like the Titans, like you value press man, you kind of need a physical guy that can jam dudes up and delay their routes. And I don't know if he would be the best fit for the Titans. So, it's kind of a cop-out answer, but like if you need him to be his own corner, yeah, you take him early. If you need him to be a wide receiver, I have no problem with you taking him early either. Like, he is, like I said, one of two in this draft class, just from an athleticism and a talent standpoint. He's just on a different plane than everybody else.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Team Ramrod also says he's also 180 pounds, so that's enough for me to prefer Carter. Fair enough there. Alex also says, how does it feel now giving the Chiefs a top 100 pick? Not great, because I think
I don't know.
I mean, we'll get into this, but when you look at that third round and how that might shake out this year again, there's going to be a couple players that you're really saying to yourself, I wish the Titans had a third round pick. As I start my evaluation here.
I don't know that there's anybody in that range that I would look at and say I would rather have than a healthy L'Jarius Sneed.
And that's true. Yep.
Assuming he is back to healthy,
yes.
Which there's no reason we have no information to suggest otherwise. I'd rather have Sneed than the pick.
Yeah, that is fair. I didn't really even think about it that way, but I think that's you gave. I mean, you're totally right. You gave up that pick to get L'Jarius Sneed, kind of weighing those outcomes. That's where those players will be, graded on for sure. I think.
I also don't think, JT, that people. I feel like there's a lot of people that are just now kind of ramping up to the draft talk, and I feel like once people start catching up on what an absolute crapshoot day 2 and day 3 of this thing are going to be, it might make that thing look a little bit different.
Yeah, I think I'm with you there. That's going to do it for our show today. So much draft talk to get into, and we have so many episodes coming up to get into that here. Appreciate you all being here. As going back through here, Carlos says, freakiest show ever, which I appreciate here. Eddie saying,
backwards hat boys,
really the bad boys of the 440 network,
like
as well as Team Ramrod, who says that JT, you've really gotten good at hosting the show, by the way. Nice work, pal.
You have.
I do appreciate that. And that's going to do it. Once again, thank you to our one more.
You don't want to talk about the New York Jets interviewing Mike Locksley for their head coaching position?
Like I said, earlier this week, or maybe last week, the New York Jets have put in a request to interview Stoney Keeley, Big Bird, and Timothy Robert Pattinson for their head coaching position. I don't know what they're doing, man. I don't know, but thank you to ML Rose for sponsoring the podcast. 7 locations, like I say every single time: Capitol View, Franklin, Gallatin, Melrose, Mount Juliet, Sylvan Park, and soon coming to Inglewood. Get you some ML Rose if you can. Make sure to stay safe this weekend if you are in Nashville, because it is going to be wintry and it's going to be cold and it's going to be icy. And until Tuesday, when I'm sure we'll have something to talk about, whether a new GM or some coaches being fired, but for sure some draft talk. This has been the Hot Read Podcast. We will talk to you then.